Capcom often jumps around the timelines without much explanation, but this is one of the few times they actually connected things together with major characters and major plot points. And it's like, I want to applaud that. That's actually thoughtful writing that means something. To me, this is really fascinating because not only does it set up the events of Street Fighter 3, which, are not well documented, it shows us how these two games are bridged together with Street Fighter 5 and Street Fighter 3. They are very heavily connected if you follow this specific thread. We kind of look at the Street Fighter games as like having a lot of light-hearted other stuff like that. If you look at Ed's story mode, it's very dark and it actually tells a pretty good tale there. I was kind of surprised, especially looking back in hindsight, how much is there in there if you read between the lines, squint, do all that kind of stuff. All right, guys, before I get started here, I just want to ask everyone to Psycho Crush the like button. It helps out the channel a ton. You guys know how I feel about Bison, but Bison is helping us out now, so I'm good with him. Thank you, Bison, for crushing that like button as well. But John, one of my friends once told me that watching porn for the plot is the equivalent of playing Street Fighter for the story. But you know what? I've never actually seen porn before, and I know you haven't as well, but I can guess as to what the meaning is there, right? Like it's not that, hard to kind of pick up on that basically, the plots in both of these things are not what you tune in for, right? But there's actually some legitimately good plot threads in Street Fighter 5 if you grade on a curve and you kind of squint a little bit and kind of, there's some stuff. So Bill Shakespeare, this is not, but regardless, if you enjoy following some of the story in these games, I wanted to highlight the main ones that are actually worth checking out. Here are my top 5 story threads.
You're gonna have to sell me on these too, because I actually don't remember all of them. It's been a while since I played through them, but I'm pessimistic. But go ahead, sell me.
You should be pessimistic, and especially since I'm starting with a launch roster whose all their story threads, except for just a couple, are pretty much throwaway stuff because Capcom didn't have enough characters to work with. But I'm starting here at number 5 with Nash, and again, surprise for some people, but Nash wakes up after being killed by his own military, defeated in more ways than one, as basically a zombie. All right, he's basically zombie Nash. This is what we have, and we get to see some dialogue with Nash, literally telling Guile to go home and be a family man. Like, hey, Capcom's actually doing some callbacks to notable stuff that people enjoy. Shocker, right? Anyway, tells Guile, go home, be a family man. I'm going after Bison. I'm going to end him once and for all. This actually heavily ties into numerous Nash plot threads we've seen throughout the years. They're actually bringing the past back, updating it, and giving you kind of like some, some stuff to work off of, right? So Colleen, she helps resurrect Nash at the request of Gil to help destroy Bison. This is big because it means Gil also had a hand in killing Bison, setting up the events of Street Fighter 3 where Bison is nowhere to be seen. So Colleen tells Nash that it wasn't just high-ranking officials in the military who, brought the plane in and shot him from behind and all that kind of stuff, but some of his comrades as well. But we also know that Colleen does not always tell the truth. Sometimes she's just flat out lying and other stuff. But this story arc here really illustrates how Colleen and Gil manipulated Nash and the others to kill off Bison so they could start up their new empire, their new utopia. This actually sets up the events of Street Fighter 3 and does, when you grade on a curve, a decent job of it. And I think that's important, and it kind of gets overlooked with all, Abigail farting and other crap like that happens in the other story modes that are pretty much nonsensical and don't do anything. But that's my number 5.
But that was funny. I liked the farting because I can relate. I do think that I like the way Nash was used in this, and I also will say that I appreciate the way he was used in the development of A Shadow Falls, because it's felt like he was getting set up to be like the hero of the story, right? He's back and he's going to fight Bison, and of course, spoilers, Ryu kills Bison at the end, but Nash is the one that sort of sacrifices himself, as his character kind of always has, to like make Bison like mortal again. He's the one that absorbs like a ton of Bison's power and sacrifices himself in the process. But that opens Bison up to being vulnerable enough to get hit by the Hadouken and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I appreciate Nash's story. Although I will say that as we looked into last week, his story doesn't. I mean, the whole helicopter thing shooting him doesn't seem like it's the actual background story, because that's the Bison doesn't die in that one, and Bison needs to die
Yeah.
because of Rose and all this stuff. I'm not gonna. Of course, Capcom doesn't tell congruent or linear stories. Whatever, it's fine. That's my issue with Nash, but yeah, I can appreciate how they did him in Street Fighter V.
Well, there you go. So number 4, I've got Ed. And this might be a shocker to a lot of people because you mentioned in a previous show how important Bison's extra bodies have been to the overall plot of the game. And we actually get to see that firsthand for the first time, because when you're going through Ed's story mode, you get to see him evolve into a Bison body and other stuff. Accelerated growth, the random channeling of the psycho power, the pain and the mental anguish that it takes to be a Bison clone. And why so many of these people like Abel and other stuff like that end up being are represented as such like empty shells, basically.
Yeah.
Kind of, they're growing kind of in the background and stuff like that. And this is the first time we ever get to see this up close, and it ain't pretty. It's not good. Because Ed is sitting there like having nightmares. He's growing too fast. He's like, I have to buy new clothes every month and other stuff like that. And as a Bison body enters adulthood, the rapid aging will slow down, but it's still a factor because Bison's got the all-white hair in Street Fighter V. He's still aging faster than his contemporaries. So this is filling in some of the big kind of blanks and the big questions we've had about, what is a Bison body like and other stuff. And that's all 3 people who have asked that question. There's not many who have, but regardless, it is answered for them.
I see it on a
but
tabloid. Get your Bison body ready for the holidays.
There it is.
Get abs on top of your. Oh, that's Honda, but abs on top of your fat with these 3 simple tricks.
How does that work exactly? But anyway, unfortunately for Ed, Monat comes to ruin his life quite literally and says that as he ages further, the person that's him will cease to be entirely. Yeah, he's going to get some wicked powers, but literally he's going to die or kind of cease to exist. And at the end of the story, Ed ends up fighting his best friend, Balrog, who's like his only friend actually at that point in time. And he's got to leave him behind and find Falk. If you read this closely, this story mode is actually fairly dark, and Ed doesn't have much to look forward to besides losing himself entirely and dying early. Look forward to that, Ed, because your future freaking sucks. And so we kind of look at the Street Fighter games as like having a lot of like, light-hearted other stuff like that. If you look at Ed's story mode, it's very dark, and it actually tells a pretty good tale there. I was kind of surprised, especially looking back in hindsight, how much is there in there if you read between the lines, squint, do all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I remember specifically from him, and he was in Street Fighter 4 stories too, right? Balrog's, because Ed was kind of like a son figure for Balrog, or Balrog was a father figure to him, at least when he was young for 20 minutes or however long it was. But that was super interesting because you never think of Balrog as that type of character, as a paternal or caring or nurturing in any way. And so that they explored that a little bit was fairly interesting. But then he got to be old, buff, super psycho Ed, and then here we are. But yeah, I remember that grabbing my attention for those reasons too. And yeah, I can appreciate when it gets like super dark like that, and you're actually like taking some chances. It's not as cool as farting Abigail, but there's a place for it.
Gets up there, right? So at number 3, we have Sagat. People might feel this is a bit too high of a ranking, but this is one of the few story threads that have actually resonated with gamers. A lot of the plots are almost incomprehensible, but Sagat is actually not that hard to understand and actually fairly well liked. He clutches his scar basically throughout the story mode, and that basically implies that when Ryu, did the Satsui no Hado Dragon Punch in the first Street Fighter 1 tournament, some of that evil got placed into Sagat, and it's starting to manifest itself now, all these years later, right?
It's so good. This is the best. Sagat's story is the best story in Street Fighter. I'm saying it now. Sorry, go ahead. But that's the truth.
Fair enough. Yeah. So, but very few characters actually meaningfully advance the plot in Street Fighter V, but Sagat is definitely an exception. He is now struggling with the demon that his former demon, Ryu, put there. And it might be interesting to see that Ryu and Sagat might team up in some way in the next game to help lock this evil away, as Ryu finally overcame his own Satsui no Hado problems with the inadvertent help of Nikali, right? Nikali swallowed up all his evil and, blah blah blah, whatever that kind of thing happened there. But anyway, like most of the story threads in this game, there isn't a ton of depth here, but the implications of what is happening to the king of Muay Thai are quite interesting, and giving the characters a meaningful plot point is rare. And it would be kind of cool to see, again, like I said, like Sagat and Ryu teaming up, like, the old arch enemies, like getting back together, being friends, and trying to work their way through it and stuff like that. That could be very cool. And Sagat is actually one of those characters who's evolved a lot. He was the initial main bad guy. He went to Shadaloo. He went away from those stuff, and now he's being faced with this whole dark intent, and he sympathizes with Ryu. All this stuff, he actually has a character arc.
Yo,
Wow.
that moment
So,
in
yeah.
Alpha where Sagat's just starting to become a good guy, or lean away from his Shadaloo evil tendencies, where Bison basically gets Ryu and then gives him to Sagat because Sagat wants his vengeance, right? And then Sagat's like kind of fighting him, but he's like, I don't want it like this. This is not actually the answer that I'm seeking. I do want my vengeance, but I don't want it in this form. And he tries to wake Ryu up because Ryu's in some sort of like a weird psycho hypnosis thing. He actually is instrumental in saving Ryu during the Alpha thread, and it's like, we're gonna fight, we're gonna do our rematch, but we're gonna do it on proper terms, and I'm actually
Mhm.
gonna help you right now. And those kinds of stories, like, they're fundamental, they're axiomatic, they play off of the human condition strings, something like that. Sagat's really cool, and we haven't even started to talk about how his eye patch is symbolic of him like not being able to pay attention and learning the lessons that's fun too. I did a story on that a while ago, and
Yeah.
I was happy to do that too. But yeah, Sagat, best story in all of Street Fighter.
He's actually well written. And that is it's a hard thing to find in here, but so it's like, yeah, focus more on that. When you've got stuff that's really compelling and interesting, focus more on it, and wanted to highlight it. So moving on, here at number 2, we have Colleen, and she acts heavily as the bridge between the events of the last 2 Street Fighter titles on into Street Fighter 3, where currently the timeline mostly ends. I say mostly because some of the things in Street Fighter 5 actually happen after Street Fighter 3. From there, so Colleen has a flashback where she loses everything. This is before she met Gil and all that other kind of stuff. She's like part of the Russian country army, something like that. Basically, there's a war happening. She loses her country. She loses everything. She is desperate. She is on her last legs. Gil appears to her like an angel, which he kind of is, and this sets up huge portions of the story for the current and future games. Gil is basically her salvation, and if Colleen follows him going forward, she has a place at his side. She has a prominent role, and we see this come to fruition with her and Nash. Colleen's story actually ends right at the start of Street Fighter V's main cinematic mode, and it fills in all the blanks basically. Because the big reveal, of course, is she starts off as Helen. She's lying like crazy to basically everyone, and it turns out she's working for Gil, working for Urien, all this other kind of stuff. She is part of the Illuminati, a very large part of the Illuminati, and we basically get to see this character who is kind of a background character be fully fleshed out and have a prominent role of killing Bison by reviving Nash, by getting Nash back on his feet.
Mhm.
So it to me, this is really fascinating because not only does it set up the events of Street Fighter 3, which are not well documented, it shows us how these two games are bridged together with Street Fighter 5 and Street Fighter 3. They are very heavily connected if you follow this specific thread. That to me is really the big standout thing with Colleen.
They took a character that was basically the secretary from Street Fighter 3 that didn't have a ton to do with her. Like, certain people would have remembered her just from seeing, like the cutscenes and whatnot, but she wasn't mega prominent or anything like that. And ultimately she was kind of like at secretary status, which has potential, but it has to be realized and it has to be cultivated. And when she was first released in SF5, or she was in the story before she was released, she was a DLC character, but she was kind of lukewarm, and people were like, maybe, maybe not. Over time, and I think story has something to do with this, but over time, people have warmed up to her. She has ice powers. That's funny. But people have warmed up to her,
Mhm.
and I think a big part of it is because she has this sort of presence and this position in the story. She matters, and she's done something significant, and that's going to add to a character's charisma and aura and such. And so, yeah, I can appreciate me some Colleen, and she's got some really good costumes. So
There you go. There you go. Shout out to Kitty Kaboom. But Capcom often jumps around the timelines without much explanation. But this is one of the few times they actually connected things together with major characters and major plot points. And it's like, I want to applaud that. That's actually thoughtful writing that means something. And it's like, yeah, so Colleen has got a really nice place in here. And again, I'd love to see her back in Street Fighter 6 and all this kind of stuff. Like, she should have a great place at the table. And that moves us on to the last characters at number 1. And I say characters because I have Rose and Oro, since Rose and Oro actually pretty much have the exact same plot going on. Although Rose sets up more for the next game in terms of having like time travel elements. But both of them acknowledge that Bison is gone now. And it's actually really nice to hear that, hey, Bison's officially dead for now. And you know, he's not coming back easily, right? He's been wiped from the earth, I think is the quote from it.
Mhm.
But a new energy and potentially evil presence has risen up in G. And it's worth noting that Gil has felt G's energy before, and meaning they have some ties together, even if they're loose, probably something to do with Q, right? But like, G is not a completely brand new, out of nowhere character. Gil recognizes him somehow, right? Even if no one else does. So anyway, Rose goes and fights with G, and that leads her to conclude that he will result in the end of the earth and all that we know. Oro actually has a very similar conclusion, but feels like if people are just in the right mindset and don't succumb to evil, they could, you know, combat this outcome, right? He's a little bit more confident about the potential outcome with it.
Yeah, I can
But
appreciate.
anyway, Rose.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was gonna say, like, I can appreciate especially here in season 5, because they've raised the stakes with this particular thread of the story, mainly pertaining to Rose, but like you say, Oro's kind of connected because she's talking to him as like an elder, and she's kind of bouncing this off, like, hey, this stuff's going down. Should we, you know, maybe kind of prepare? And he's like, yeah, but we'll probably be all right. People are good. And it's like, I don't know if people are good, man. Like, that's a kind of a tall order to just sort of fall back on and assume that that's all right. So.
Yeah, it's because they both agree that G is going to end the earth, but Oro's like, well, if people just have a, you know, positive mindset about it, they're going to be fine. So, but Oro's very lackadaisical about this stuff. He's very much operating on whims. So Rose feels like she's the only person who can stop G from doing this, and can do so by traveling to the past, which should heavily set up the plot of the next game and likely lead us into a bit of a greatest hits version of Street Fighter, where we see some of the iconic moments and characters depicted that we've never seen. But also events continue to expand past what happened in Street Fighter 5 and likely Street Fighter 3 as well. I think we're going to have 2 timelines, pretty, you know, if not, you know, kind of more if Rose is jumping around quite a bit. But this is number 1 for heavily cluing us into the next game. Because it's like, hey, this is what's coming. Here is what you should expect. This is, you know, what Street Fighter 6 is going to be, or the next Street Fighter project, all that kind of stuff. Like, and that rarely happens in a Capcom fighting game. It's like, oh, like, you're actually setting up the next game, and there's some reasonable plot threads to follow here. We know we've got to get more into Street Fighter 3 and Q and G and Gil and all this other kind of stuff, but you're actually setting this stuff up. And like, if you execute it well, if you pay it off well, this could be really cool. Like, there's some good stuff going on here. But then they you know, they do something like Luke story mode, and then it's like, oh, okay, well,
I'm just waiting for
maybe I
Street Fighter
should be
6 to all just be about Fong's backstory.
yes. So there's my top 5. I do think there's some really cool threads in here, and I do think there's some good writing that Capcom has done, but it's also hard to piece together. The execution really needs to improve. The way that you make this stuff better is you make it cohesive, you make it easy to follow. And there's, you know, plenty of examples like that in past Street Fighter games and other stuff. Like Guile's plot's really easy to follow. It's simple. Go be a family man, you know, let go of Nash dying and all this other kind of stuff, but, you know, still be a good person. All this kind of stuff, like, that's not hard to follow. There's a lot of archetypes they can work off of. So I'm hoping they level up their execution like they said they would. Ono said this previously. He said with Street Fighter 5, he said, look, we're not going to have an NRS level of story in this game. We just, you know, don't have the resources and time to pull this off. It's not going to be that level. He said, but look forward to the next game. We know Ono never lies or misleads anyone, so I'm very heavily looking forward to the Street Fighter 6 plot, and of course it's going to be perfect without flaw. So
Ain't nothing terrible gonna happen today.